Environment and Culture Factors by Kayla Reeder for refugees. Cultural environment factors that affect the health and well-being of refugees can come in many different forms, one of which is media. The media can have a great impact on how refugees are perceived by the receiving countries and by the neighbors of the refugees. When refugees paint them in a great light and use context in their story that help them see that this is a really great humanitarian opportunity and that these refugees have been through so much, versus when they talk about how they're a threat to our economy or a burden on society, can really impact how people treat them and how they see them, and if people want to get involved to continue to help them. Um, and so, terminology used such as like asylum seeker or refugees within media has been shown to have more positive effects than when they say migrant or immigrant or even more intrusive terminology. Um, so, something that definitely can influence their health and overall well being. Unfortunately, refugees don't always have a lot of family support. As you can imagine, having to flee your country sometimes ultimately and unfortunately can lead to deaths. Many people don't survive the migration process. Many families are separated, whether it be because only a mother and her children are able to escape, and the father has to stay there, or is killed, or um, when people maybe a few siblings are able to make one boat, and the next round of siblings have to wait for another boat, and they end up being separated and. So the U.S. does make an effort to reunify um, immediate family members, but ultimately they are at risk for not having that family support, and so they have to rely on their communities for support. And without that support, they're at risk for just not being able to cope and do as well, not having someone to check in and say, hey, I really noticed that this is going on, should we get that checked out, or can I bring you a bowl of soup when you're sick, things like that. They have to kind of stand on their own and don't have somebody looking out for them as much like family members would. Their peers have a huge influence on their health outcomes. Better coping and adapting skills, which influence mental health. Refugees are at risk for things like um, PTSD and anxiety and separation anxiety, things like that. And so, when you have someone to talk to and share those worries and fears with, and have a peer to encourage you and take you under your wing, show you the ropes, we really see that refugees do better when they have a peer facilitator or a mentor. Someone that can be their cheerleader. We also see that they are able to keep their jobs and internships better, and having those connections with peers really helps them thrive and do better economically as well. It's kind of a cool program that we have here in Utah that refugees, once they're established and kind of have the ropes, they can be peers for other refugees, which is huge because they can share that experience, and in a way that we can't know that and share those things with them until we've been through it. They're at an increased risk for bullying and isolation, which can really negatively impact their mental health and even physical health. Um, and so relying on the community and peers for socialization and support can have a big impact on the health of our refugees, because they come from such a wide variety of backgrounds and natures. We have refugees from all over the world. There's varying risks for them. However, something that we do see cycles of in the United States and here in Utah are that refugees have a leading rate of entrepreneurship. When they come to the United States, they start from the ground up and really build something for themselves. They have a strong work ethic, um, typically is what we are seeing, and are really willing to work and build a life for themselves. And so um, they tend to do really well with that. We also know that they are, again, at increased risk for mental health problems. And heartbreakingly, there we see cycles of human trafficking and abuse, specifically in refugee women as well. Um, and so, obviously, someone being trafficked or abused um, can have negative implications on their physical and mental health. And we can really do a lot to improve that by bringing awareness of these issues. See something, say something is one of the common terms for human trafficking prevention groups. And we can learn more about that and educate ourselves. The legal and political system really is one of the biggest barriers that refugees face in order to find asylum or find a new home. In the United States, the power is given from the government to the individual states to determine refugee status, how many refugees they will take in, and what the legality of each refugee would, or what the process is that they have to go through to obtain citizenship for that state after they've received citizenship for the United States. For instance, there's a law in place that refugees in Utah must have a health screening, both for mental and physical health disparities. That can help us identify and start to treat and correct some health problems that these refugees are very susceptible to or might have pre-existing when they come here. This helps us give them the best health care that we can and get them started off on the right foot, and it also helps protect our community as a whole, as a lot of these refugees haven't had access to things like vaccination and clean, healthy water and foods. They've been in refugee camps with other people that have had a lot of exposure to really rough elements and lack of hygiene and things like that. So um, that's one of the things that the legal system affects as far as their health goes. Um, Being that they are from a different culture and language, a lot of times they'd have legal literacy disadvantages. They just don't know our legal system. They don't know if they're being taken advantage of or if they're receiving the health care that they deserve. And so we need to advocate for them and look out for them and help them learn so they can be their own advocate as well and have better health outcomes. Potential barriers are obviously culture and language. If somebody's not used to receiving the healthcare that we have out here, or religious backgrounds sometimes really affect, like modern medicine, if they're willing to seek out treatment for things, or if they are used to like seeing a shaman or medicine man or praying about it or something, then they may not know that, hey, I need to go to the hospital for my um, left-sided weakness on my facial droop, things like that. So, um, mental health is obviously a huge barrier. Um, the trauma and things that they go through is going to really set them back, and they may not have the knowledge that they need to advocate for themselves and realize that it's okay to speak up and talk about these things. Um, Having accessibility, even geographically, to healthcare that they need can be a potential barrier as well. Not being able to drive or living across town and having to take the bus or things like that. Internationally, there's 70.8 million refugees displaced worldwide. This is not a local problem. As we talked about, they are at high risk for isolation, hate crimes, refugeeism is a huge controversy, not just here in our country, but across the world. And so this isn't just a local issue. And the different environments that they find themselves in, a lot of times they just try to make it to the next safest location, a neighboring country or nation. And so they're really confined to the accessibility and what that nation has available for them. socioeconomic status has a huge effect on, or is a huge barrier to overcome for refugees. They're leave everything they have and have to start from the ground up. They really don't come into this country as wealthy, high economical status people. They have low income typically. They have difficulty finding employment. There's lots of barriers to that. They're typically less educated and can't compete with the education that we've received out here. They have to start from the ground up. And we talked about, however, though, that they are leading in entrepreneurship due to some of that as well. Race and ethnicity. There are a variety of ethnicities that come into the United States and into Utah specifically as a refugee. And so being a minority, even when they're placed with like cultural people, they're still a minority, and they're therefore at risk for discrimination. Even though we attempt to relocate citizens with from the same geographical location, it doesn't always work out that way. So they might be isolated. There's also genetic risks. Every ethnicity has their own set of genetic um, risk factors, and refugees are not an exception to that. Religion is definitely plays a part for many of the backgrounds of our refugees. Many of them are running from religious persecution, and so religion can be a really good place for them to find support and a way to connect. Religion also contributes to their identity, and a loss of religion could equal a loss of identity, and then that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is not being met. Many have religious beliefs that defer them from seeking medical treatment, and so we need to be aware of that and know how we can support them and how we can educate them and help them. Um, Gender wise, there's about equal numbers represented in Utah as far as male and female. However, women are at a higher risk for abuse and women trafficking. Also, gender will affect some religious things like how the women dress, and how they feel about having certain assessments done. Mental health wise, men are not as willing to talk about their mental health issues as women might be, so that's something we need to be aware of. There are in Utah specifically more women specific resources than there are for men. There are not as many resources for men, ironically, as there are for women. So that's another um, thing that they will find when they come here to Utah. Geographical location, refugeeism is a global issue. Um, Many flee to the nearest, closest country, as we've talked about. We do try to reassign with communities of like culture, but they really are just going to be subject to the laws and the health care of their new country. These are some of the most commonly seen um, areas that people flee from as of right now. There are certainly implicit and explicit biases that, as healthcare providers, we need to recognize in ourselves so we can identify that and not have that be a part of the care that we give to our refugee patients. Some implicit can be just a disconnection of humanity. We don't realize what they've been through, and we're less likely to recognize what the things that they've been through and see them as an equal. The media has an influence, assumption of threat to the health system being a burden on the healthcare and economics, assuming crime, the socioeconomic status of them being lower economically on that poll, language barriers, things like that can really affect the healthcare that they receive. And then there's also explicit um, bias such as racism and prejudice or political beliefs that can affect the quality of care that they get or the laws that are in place for them to get the best health care that they need. Internationally, poor living conditions, dangerous, violent backgrounds, separation from family, malnutrition, all this lack of basic security and human needs. We really can do a lot of good to help our refugee friends get the best health care that they need. They do have the cards stacked against them, but I know that there's lots of good that can be done, and we're headed in the right direction.